Hello, how you doing? Welcome. My name is Johan. That's me according to Twitter, or actually I put it there, so it's according to me. I work at a company called iTeam. And the instructions for these slides was don't put the company logo on every slide, but it's in every slide because someone else made the template and I'm really bad at design, so I just reused it. At iTeam, we work with digitalizing companies and organizations using strategy, code, and culture. And my role there is to work mainly with the strategy and the culture parts, which means I don't have that much time left over for coding now, which is a bit sad, but I try to do as much as possible of it in my free time. Now, this talk is actually going to be most interesting, I think, for me, because as I was just putting the finishing touches on it yesterday morning, I accidentally ended up rewriting the whole thing from scratch. So I don't really know where this is going. I hope it's going to work out. And since I'm a hardline no estimates guy, I have no idea how long it's going to take. But the doors are locked, so let's get started. The basic premise of this talk is to try to figure out how to understand where we're heading, and doing that by looking at where we came from. Because if you want to lead, or if you want to get your organization or your friends or your company to go in a certain way, it's good to know where you're supposed to be going. And what I want to do first is try to describe 3 major shifts that are taking place right now. The first one is one of technical revolutions. As you probably know, we've gone through a number of industrial revolutions. The first one was somewhere around the 1760s. That's when we invented steam power, basically. So we got mechanical production, we got railroads, and the steam power. The second revolution was around the 1870s. That revolution was one of mass production. We got electric power. We got the assembly line. The third one in around 69, 70 is the digital revolution. So it's called the third industrial revolution or the first digital revolution. And that's when we got computers, automated production, electronics. And right now, we are at the beginning of a new revolution, but we don't really know what it is. Is it the fourth industrial, the second digital? And more importantly, the revolution of what? Is it the always connected revolution? Is it the everything about you is being recorded and analyzed revolution? The rise of the machines? We don't know. But what we do know is that before this revolution started happening, when we were at the end of the last one, we were in a special place. We had experience, we had tools, we had best practices, we had standards, we had white papers. We knew what we were doing. Here, we don't have that. We have immense opportunity, but our tools are inaccurate and our intuitions are probably wrong. So how do we play that? Well, let's just go back once more across these revolutions, because every revolution, apart from having benefits and things that we got, it also had its losers. So the first industrial revolution had its losers in form of the so-called landed nobility. At the time, you couldn't really increase the output of a given area of land. So the only way to get rich was to own more land. That's why we had all these big wars, because we wanted to expand the territory. And that's why the rich people were the ones who owned a lot of land. Then came the Industrial Revolution. And all of a sudden you could increase the output of a given area by orders of magnitude. So that's why you can see the British aristocracy today basically renting out their castles to tourists to fund themselves. They were the losers of the first industrial revolution. The second one basically it was electricity that was the big driver. So everyone who built gas-powered devices, or the ice deliverers, they went into bankruptcy. The third one is basically the death of anyone supplying analog solutions, technology, and distribution. And we're still seeing this death happening right now. So that's the first piece of the puzzle. The second thing to understand about technical revolutions is that it changes not only how we behave, but it changes the natural quanta, the natural size of things. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's have a look at this. This is Scania, Swedish lorry manufacturer. This is their current truck, and that's their picture of the future. This is the vision that they have. I would say that this is wrong. This is another Swedish company called Einride. So this is their vision of the future, and you can see that they're fairly different. This one is a lot smaller. Why is that? Well, it's because the size of a truck, the natural size of a truck, is basically defined by the booth and the cost of the driver. So you need the truck to be big enough to pay for the driver. If you remove the driver, you remove the booth, and you decrease the natural size of the truck. Because now you can, they go cheaper, so you can have smaller payloads every time, and they can slipstream. Now, this is not the future. They expect to have their first cars on the road in testing next year and be in full operation by 2020. So this change is already happening. The other thing that's important to realize about technological change is that the effects are seldom technological. So the consequences of big technological shifts are social and economical. And that's how we must understand them. We were with my job to visit the apartment of August Strindberg, a Swedish author. He lived up there on the top floor, really nice apartment, and this was in the hallway, an elevator. When he had his moving in party, he sent out cards to everyone he knew, and on every card it said, "You're welcome to my moving in party, there is an elevator." Now, why did he write that? Well, it was basically so that no one would think that he'd suddenly become poor. Because up until then, poor people lived on the top floor. Rich people lived on the bottom floor, because then you were closer to the yard and the party. The elevator was not just a technological shift. It shifted the entire housing market. Every apartment got a new price. So if we want to understand, say, autonomous vehicles, now this is the sort of the usual way to look at it, like what happens in the car. We can start playing board games on the way to work. I would say if we want to understand the effects of autonomous vehicles, it might look something like this. This was a small proof of concept that we did where we basically mapped the prices of apartments against the time that it takes to travel into town. And then compare that to how fast it would go if you traveled by car with no traffic, i.e. a situation with all autonomous vehicles. And basically say, will this apartment increase or decrease in value depending on how it changed? This might be another way to illustrate the effects of autonomous vehicles. Because almost all transplanted organs today come from people who are killed in traffic. It's simply one of the few times that young and healthy people die. Which means that autonomous vehicles means no more organs. Which means, of course, that we're going to have to work hard on the biotech industry. Now let's take that thought a step further. What happens then? Well, we're already at the point where Pistorius could run faster than a person with normal legs because of his prosthetic limbs. Okay? And every major shift in people's minds occur over generations. So my kids will grow up in a world where artificial organs and limbs are better than human organs and limbs. They will be the acceptance generation. So I expect that my daughter's kids will probably be the first generation to willingly replace limbs. Because that's the way it moves. We're moving into an age of post-humanity. Okay, second major shift. Let's look at the civilizational stages of humanity. So the start of history was sometime around 5,500 to 5,300 BC. That's when history started, because that's when we got writing. Before that is called prehistory. So history itself is defined by language and writing. That's what enables civilization. Okay? Then we move into the next phase, which is called the modern period. The modern period started somewhere around 1440 AD, and is basically defined by the printing press. Again, what happened when we invented written language, we could store more information. We did no longer have to constrict our tribes to about 150 people, so we could start building cities. The printing press enabled mass communication and mass storage of information, which meant that we could make the next leap, and that's what's called the modern period. Still, it's based on language and distribution of knowledge. So what's the next phase? Well, I would say that we're in it now. In 1989, the World Wide Web was proposed by Tim Berners-Lee in a paper. And apart from further increasing the amount of usable information that we can access, the protocol, HTTP, reveals another major shift. So these are the verbs of HTTP. And this is significantly different from the Gutenberg press, because that was in the hands of the few. And all the rest of us were restricted to get. We could read the information. Now we can provide the information. We're moving from distribution of information to discussions and collaborations. And now we also have this, the pull request. A way of saying that while your idea might be good, I can augment it. I can make it better. I don't even have to know you to collaborate with you. So what we're doing is we're defining a new norm. And in an age where collaborative creation is the norm, we're no longer standing on the shoulders of giants. We're constantly climbing the shoulders of each other. And this changes how we see the world. It creates new values. We start moving from a nuclear family into more of a tribal community, because you're closer with a lot more people. We're moving from what I call a concentric identity. This is actually from a former Prime Minister Carl Bildt wrote his memoirs, and he called it Hallänning svensk europé. So my county, my country, and the världsdel. Continent, thank you. That's a concentric identity. That's how I define myself. We don't have that anymore. We're moving into more of a hyper-local. Basically, this is my block. This is where I am physically. And the next step is the world. Those are the two parts of the new identities. Because we're moving from proximity-based company, as in these are the people who are geographically close to me and they define me, into a subject-based bubbles, as in these people around the world who have normal interests like me, like watching videos on math and quantum mechanics on YouTube at night. Those normal people are the ones that I will hang out with. And this changes how we view things. This changes where we place our identity and our safe spaces. Nowhere in here is a nation state, for example. That's a casualty of war in this case. We don't really care. Now this shift, I call it the rise of the netocrat. Because what happens now is that with access to all these people, with no geographic restrictions, with co-collaboration, co-creation, and constant discussion, it becomes more about who you know than what you know. So the old way to look at things would be for me to say, I know so many things, you should all listen to me, and if some of you gave me an idea outside, I would immediately claim it as my own, and I would tell you, because that would raise my value in your eyes. Now what we're starting to learn is that that's too limiting. And it's actually better for me to tell you who told me about the idea. Because what happens when I constantly refer to other people and refer people to each other is that I place myself at the center of the social graph. Now you will value me for the fact that if you know me, you get to know so many other people. You will extend your knowledge of the graph through me. So it's not about me, it's about who I know. Also, this is where the individual dies. Because the individual was defined by the fact that the thoughts and the creational process took place inside my head, which is mine. Now everything that we create is created in interaction between each other. It's not the dots, it's the lines of the graph that defines creation. The individual becomes the dividual. I'm defined by my context, not by myself. So, supporting and promoting others is slowly becoming the new norm. It's not new, but it's been supercharged by the advances in technology. And that's what's changing behavior. Okay, third major shift. Evolutionary jumps. So, this is how we got humanity, right? We had these evolutional stages that ended up in the epitome of evolution. The Homo sapiens sapiens, the sentient being, somewhere around at least 300,000 years ago. So is there a next step here? Well, we already know that Homo sapiens sapiens won over the Neanderthals, and probably because of social skills and language. So is there any threat to our species right now? Well, some would say that it's AGI, artificial general intelligence. That could be the next species that supplants us. Who knows? It still seems quite far off, but that might be deceptive. Let me illustrate why. Because when it comes to exponential change, our intuition breaks down. We're really, really bad at understanding exponential change, which is another word for saying constant acceleration. So let's just take an example. If we could build a rocket that accelerated constantly with 1g, that's a bit slower than Tesla P100D, that accelerates at 1.1. So it's a sports car acceleration, not a rocket acceleration, but it's constant. If we could do that and get it to accelerate halfway to Mars and then decelerate the other way, the other half, how long would it take to reach Mars? Anyone? Guesses? No? Okay, usually guesses range from like 10 months to 10 years, someone said 100 years, and the correct answer is 3 days. That's how fast it goes. Sports car acceleration, but constant, you reach Mars in 3 days. If you keep accelerating and you keep doing that until you reach Jupiter, you're there in 4.5 days. That's not intuitive, because that's not how our brains work. We're really bad at guessing these things. So let's have a look at what we've seen the past few years. Another example of exponential change. Moore's law, constant acceleration, doubling of the number of processors every 18 months. What does that look like? Well, in 1946, we got the first digital computer, ENIAC. It took us 50 years until 1996 until we achieved what was then called AI, which was a computer beating a human at chess. So IBM's Deep Blue beat Kasparov in 96. It then took an additional 15 years before, no, 25 years, before IBM's Watson wins Jeopardy over 3 reigning American champions. And 5 years after that, before AlphaGo beats Lee Sedol in Go. Now, to understand how amazing this thing is, you need to understand that Go is the oldest game that we humans still play. It's 2,500 years old, and since the 1600s, people have been pros in Japan. They've been paid to play Go, not as a sport, but as a branch of philosophy. It's been regarded as a way to understand humanity and life. So for 400 years they've been doing this. And a computer just beat the human. Just 1 year after that, the Chinese champion Ni Weiping said this: Go is not as simple as we thought. There is still huge room for we humans to explore. Either AlphaGo or Master. It's sent by the Go God to guide humans. And to quote Wally Weaver from Watchmen, now if you begin to feel an intense and crushing feeling of religious terror at the concept, don't be alarmed. That indicates only that you're still sane. So I'm not saying that we are close to AGI. I'm just saying that it's hard to grasp how close we may be. But also, do we really need AGI to be able to define the next evolution in the species? I would say not. Because I would claim that we're already entering that phase. We're going from the Homo sapiens, the sentient human, to the augmented human. Now, if you listen to the keynote this morning, you got told about virtual reality and the struggles of virtual reality. I would claim that we already have it. It's just that for us who grew up with the emergence of the technology, for us who are firmly rooted in the physical world, we need something to define the virtual reality as real. The digital landscape does not become real until we are immersed, until we can feel and touch it. For my daughter who is 10, it's already here. She lives with her friends online as her primary world. Now it's really interesting, every time we have a major shift, we also have a shift in language. New words emerge and old words disappear. Okay, so in early industrial years, we had the word store-bought. You could buy store-bought bread, the new thing. The other thing was just called bread, because there's never a name for the default. Okay, and then all of us started buying store-bought bread, so that became bread, and now we have home-baked bread, homemade. That's a new word, didn't exist before. We used to have digital cameras. Now there are analog cameras. The new words tell us where the shift is going. And we can see a shift like that. We used to have IRL. Then it became AFK. Now there's a new word emerging. The meat world. The default is shifting. We are too old to see that. We're too old to experience that. And sometimes I wonder if this whole VR thing is just a way for us to realize that the real world has moved. So we're becoming a new species in a new environment, a new context. So, what do we do with this? What do we do with all this information or speculation? Well, when everything is changing, when everything is moving, we have no prior knowledge to lean on. So how do we navigate? Well, I've spent this whole time just asking a lot of questions, and I wish I had some really good answers, but I don't. But I would say that I have some tips. The first one, there's something called the Kinnaman framework. Now this is Celtic, so of course the fact that it's pronounced Kinnaman has got nothing to do with how it's spelled. I recommend that you familiarize yourselves with this framework. It's actually a really good way of understanding how to tackle the problems that we encounter. Because the thing is, as I said before, we're moving out of the phase where we knew everything and everything had been done before and everything was a commodity and everything could be produced at scale or outsourced to India or Ukraine. What that's describing is what the Kinnaman framework describes as the simple or the obvious problems. They are defined by the fact that the cause and effect relationships are perceivable, they are predictable, they are repeatable. That's where we have best practice. We sense, we categorize, we respond. It's very, very simple. Then we have the complicated problems. They're a bit like the obvious ones, but the cause and effect relationships are separated in time and/or space. Basically, we need a pre-study. And if we just calculate all the steps, we can actually predict what's going to happen. So we have good practices. You can do it this way or this way, but not this way. And what we do is we sense and then we analyze that and then we respond. But more and more we're moving into the area of what's called the complex problems. Now, the complex problems basically describe everything that you usually do as a developer that has anything to do with the customer expectations and what the customers want and like, which changes because then then Apple releases the Apple Watch and then Android replies with something else, and every time something changes, we don't know where we're going. We have to try stuff. So the complex problems are defined by the fact that the cause and effect relationships are observable in retrospect only. And the worst part is that they're not repeatable. If you implement, I don't know, say continuous delivery in your organization, it's going to change the organization. You can't implement continuous delivery one more time and expect a new result or the same result. So what we have to use is what we call emergent practice, as in we probe and sense and respond. Basically, we do stuff, we release it, we look back, and we analyze the response. And then we correct the course. There's a fourth part of Kinnaman, which is called the chaotic realm. Cause-effect relationships are not perceivable. Novel practice, act, sense, respond. This is applicable in some cases. There was some guy who published a hack for GitHub, and what they did was they shut down the service, they suspended his account, then they looked into what had actually happened, and they actually gave him his account back afterwards. This is basically the house is on fire, just get out, and then we'll see what we'll do situation. My second tip is this: learn from the ants. Now, ant paths are really interesting. They form spontaneously. They're very much like neurons in the human brain or in any brain. As in, one ant, where every ant basically just goes around, doesn't know where it's going, and then it finds a piece of food. So it starts going around again, trying to find its way back to the anthill, and it sends out a pheromone telling all the other ants, I found food. Now what's going to happen is that every ant that encounters that tries to follow the path of that ant. And it's like going like this. But for every ant that joins it, they also start putting out this pheromone trail. And what happens is that the trail spontaneously straightens out by the sheer mass of ants who are going there. So there is no single point in time where we can say that's when the path formed. It forms over time. Okay? And I would say that the evolution that we're going through now follows the same pattern. People are running around trying out different stuff. And if you try to watch it, and if you try to follow in a diligent way, you might be the first one to point at the ant path and say, that's actually where we're heading. This is what's actually going on. Basically, it means that leadership is not about pointing out the way and saying, that's where we're going. It's more about observing and saying, aha, so that's where we're going. The third tip, avoid static conflict. I'm sorry. Or at least avoid getting stuck in it. So what do I mean by static conflict? Let's take as example what I call the global megatrends and their counter movements. And by the global megatrends, I basically mean the things that I've brought up so far as the shifts. It's digitalization, it's the netocracy, and it's the post-humanity. These are megatrends as in they happen whether we want it or not. And they also have their counter movements, their oppositions. So basically, there's this dynamic process. Things change. It follows the ant, or forms the ant path. It's not the will of a single individual, but it happens. It's a dynamic movement forward. And then someone steps off, because every movement has its critics. These are critics of the idea and the movement itself. So this could be, if we're talking about the digitalization, these could be the nationalists who say, hey, wait, we don't want this. We don't want the nation state to go away. We're off. We don't like this. And they start criticizing it. Or we can say, I don't know, let's take feminism. These are the anti-feminists. These are the masculinists, the ones that hate the movement and the ideas, okay? So then other people step off on the other side and they form an opposition to them. These are the critics, not of the idea, but of the movement. They like the idea, but they want it to be static. So they seek conflict. So in the case of digitalization and the death of the nation state, we have the nationalists and we have the violent anti-fascists. When it comes to the netocracy and the death of the individual, we have the postmodern left and the identitarian right. In the case of post-humanity and the succession of Homo sapiens sapiens, we have the religion of nature. Anything natural is good, and we should not vaccinate our kids. And on the other hand, we have a few AI hypers. Now, these two groups depend on each other. They feed on the conflict. They drive each other apart. And that's how they strengthen their positions. And that's how they root themselves and prevent anything from moving. And if you want to understand where we're going and be able to influence where we're going, you should not get stuck in that conflict. Because it's counterproductive. It's about anchoring everything to the present. What you want to do is you want to follow the dynamic movement. So instead of starting to fight with people at work about what technology or what framework you should use, that's the static conflict. Instead, focus on how to work to make it easier to change the technologies or frameworks that you use. That's the dynamic resolution. The conflict is inconsequential. It doesn't matter who wins, as long as you make sure that you can keep moving. Which leads us to tip number 4, and that is that you need to minimize your cost of change. Don't look at the nominal cost of implementation. Look at how to turn back. Because you're going to make a lot of mistakes. There are going to be a lot of errors along the way. So when you're choosing which path to take, don't choose the easiest one to get started on. Choose the one that seems easiest to turn back from and undo. Because then you will never invest in the direction, but you will invest in the exploration. So minimize the cost of changing. And lastly, be the follower, not the leader. There is a TED talk where a guy talks about the start of a movement, where he says that the first follower is what turns a lone nut into a leader. And so many times you're going to find that it's much more rewarding and you create more lasting changes, not by stepping up to be the leader, but stepping up to be the first person to point at one of your colleagues and says, this woman is right. We should do it her way. And it also ties back to this whole idea of the netocrat, the person who defines him or herself in terms of the social graph. So remember, being the netocrat is not about you, it's about the context that you create. Thank you. Question how long it took was 36 minutes.